This video discusses the Sanitary Transportation of Human and Animal Food Rule, which is one of the rules within the Food Safety Modernization Act. As with other videos on this website, this is specifically focused on animal food and livestock feed mills. This rule was published in April of 2016, and this recording is being done in May of 2018, 1 month after small business compliance was effective. There is guidance to industry that has been issued on this topic, and that will be posted below the link on this for this video as well. When you're thinking about sanitary transportation, the focus needs to be on spoilage or on food safety, not spoilage or quality. So and you also need to think about this rule from an inbound ingredient perspective and an outbound finished feed perspective. So the FDA recognizes much of this rule is already industry best practice, but at this point, it's always good to go back and make sure that you are in full compliance. So the rule applies to shippers, loaders, carriers, and receivers of food transported in the United States by motor or rail vehicle, whether or not that food enters interstate commerce. So persons who ship food into the United States from Canada or Mexico by motor or rail would need to comply with this, and shippers who ship food into the United States by any means that is then moved by motor or rail. And throughout the presentation, we'll talk about some of the situations that you may find that apply. What I have done here is I have highlighted and put in bold the situations that apply to animal food and specifically livestock feed mills. So the rule does not apply when food is transported in the United States by barge, ship, or air. Transportation by a farm is not governed by this rule. Food fully enclosed by a container is not governed by this rule, except if it requires temperature control for safety. Don't think you're going to find that in a livestock feed mill application. Live food animals, human food byproducts for use in animal food without further processing. So those are some of the things that it does not apply to. It does apply to bulk animal feed, food not fully enclosed by a container, think of fresh produce. Feed bags are considered fully enclosed. There is a question on bags that are not polywoven. This was not addressed in the guidance to industry, so we will probably need to wait and see if that presents itself as an issue as this rule is further expands. We'll look at some definitions that are noted in this rule. The shipper is the person who, for example, a manufacturer or a freight broker who arranges for the transportation of food in the United States by a carrier or multiple carriers sequentially. You are the shipper of your finished feed that you are arranging for the transportation from your facility to the farm, and you're required to follow this rule for that definition. You may be the shipper if you arrange for the transportation of a raw material or ingredient, either by backhauling it on your truck, going to pick it up, or calling for a third-party transportation company to move that for you. The loader is defined as the person who loads the food onto a motor or rail vehicle during transportation operations. The carrier is the person who physically moves the food by rail or motor vehicle in commerce. The term carrier does not include a person who transports food while operating a parcel service. They have exempted the parcel services from this rule. The receiver means a person who receives food at a point in the United States after transportation, whether or not that person represents the final point of receipt for the food. So it's any receiver within the supply chain. A bulk vehicle means a tank car, hopper, truck, rail tank car, hopper car, cargo car, portable tank, freight container, hopper bin, or any other vehicle in which the food is shipped in bulk when the food comes directly into contact with the vehicle itself. And I think in the livestock feed operation, there's a great deal of this applicability. There are 4 key parts to the rule. We're going to go over each part in detail. So the first part is vehicles and transportation equipment. In this section of the rule, the equipment must be designed and suitable to be adequately cleanable for its intended purposes. It needs to be maintained in sanitary condition, and it needs to be stored in a manner that prevents harboring of pests or becoming contaminated in any manner. So your standard operating procedures for the maintenance of your vehicles play an important role in this section of the rule. Transportation operations, we're going to go over several slides in this element, and one person can perform multiple roles. So there's not necessarily a different person for each of the 4 roles that we defined. The general responsibilities of this rule apply to all 4 of these roles, and that is ensuring the safety of food. There are also designated responsibilities that may be assigned in a written agreement to another party for carrying out some of the roles in the operations. So some of the general requirements are to prevent contamination of raw foods or non-food items and the protection of food transported in bulk from contamination by a previous shipment. In your standard operating procedures, you need to be ensuring that you identify what the previous load was that was carried in an inbound bulk vehicle as well as outbound bulk vehicle, and make sure that it is not a prohibited product, or if it required clean out, that clean out was performed, and that you're sequencing your trucks, especially for medicated feeds and non-medicated feeds. If a shipper, loader, receiver, or carrier becomes aware of an indication of a possible material failure in temperature control or other conditions that may render the food unsafe, then they need to ensure that it will not be sold or otherwise distributed. These persons must take appropriate action, including as necessary communication with other parties to ensure the food is not sold. So once you've decided that you're going to reject a load of a raw material or ingredient, you need to communicate with other parties in the supply chain to make sure that they understand why you rejected that load and that appropriate action is taken to dispose of that or use it in a way under conditions that it would not be defined as unsafe. The shipper must develop and implement written procedures subject to the records requirement of this rule. So as we defined under the CFD, FSMA, CGMP programs, written procedures for your transportation operations, those written procedures are a requirement of this rule. So your vehicles and equipment and the maintenance of the sanitary condition of those need to be defined in writing. Previous cargo does not make the food unsafe. That is your documentation, your written documentation of the previous load. So those are required records. The roles and responsibilities for loaders are inspecting at loading of the vehicle for cleanliness. Pre-cooling is probably not a concern for a livestock feed mill. But making sure that the vehicle has been cleaned out prior to loading it with any feed in the process. Receivers only have temperature abuse responsibilities, in terms of the sanitary transportation rule, but there are many other rules that the receivers have other requirements for making sure the food is safe and not cross-contaminated and things like that. So the carrier, upon request and if agreed upon by contract, must disclose the identity of the most recent prior bulk load and the cleaning requirements. This is something that you need to require of your carriers to make sure that there is no contamination of a raw material or ingredient or a feed from a previous load. Rail cars are uniquely different from motor freight vehicles. Some of the comments in the rule stated that the rail operators often do not own, prepare, or operate the equipment. The shipper and the loader are responsible for the sanitary condition of the rail cars unless that responsibility is reassigned to another party in writing. That's a very important element of this rule. There is a training requirement, which is the third element of this rule. And when the carrier and the shipper have agreed in a written contract that the carrier is responsible for the sanitary transportation, carrier personnel must be trained adequately, and that training must be documented. You as the carrier and shipper of outbound freight are responsible for training your drivers on the sanitary transportation of the food that they're entrusted with, and that training must be documented. We'll go back to the general requirements in this section A5 here. If the roles are under one ownership or operational control, then all of these roles can operate under a common set of written procedures subject to the records requirement. The loader requirements must still be met regardless, so the person loading the vehicle must determine that it is clean and not cross-contaminated in any way. So you could have one set of common operating procedures for shippers, receivers, and carriers if all of those parties are under one operational control. Records, this rule has records requirements for the shipper. There must be records that demonstrate that the shipper provides information to the carrier on the sanitary requirements for transportation. Written agreements must be in place when the responsibility is assigned to a third party. This includes sequencing and flush records, third-party assignment letters, things of that nature. Your carriers must have written procedures, written agreements, and training records. In terms of loaders and receivers, there are no required records. So in closing this, I would like to read one of the comments from the rule and the interpretation of the rule, because this is a real-life situation that can often cause some confusion. And then I'm going to read the response from the FDA for this. So comment 36 reads, one comment asks us to consider situations that include several different transportation legs in determining how parties are defined or whether specific responsibilities assigned on the basis of the roles the person involved in transportation operations play are even necessary. So the scenario here is corn grain is harvested and it's taken in a semi-trailer by a farmer to the grain elevator, where it's loaded on a rail car and transported to the Mississippi River. It's loaded onto a barge for additional transport. Upon arrival, the grain is offloaded into a rail car and is then sent to the feed mill for mixing into a hog feed. So this comment is seeking clarification on the various transportation elements of this scenario. The response is, in this example, the initial transportation operation would not be subject to the rule because it involves the transportation of food by the farm, and the farms do not need to comply with this rule. In the example described in this comment, the grain elevator would be the receiver. The second segment of the transit is subject to this rule because the transportation operation is by a rail vehicle, and the shipper, loader, carrier, and receiver would be the persons who meet the definitions as defined in the rule. These may not be separate persons, as we just discussed. The shipper and the loader may be the same person. The third segment of transportation is not subject to the rule because it involves transportation by a river barge, and the fourth segment of the transportation is subject to the rule in the same manner as the second segment. So the FDA goes on to acknowledge that the situation may occur where not all parties involved in transportation operations are subject to the rule. The shipper, for example, the shipper is a non-covered business, but the carrier is subject to the rule. In these situations, interactive requirements among covered entities established by this rule, including communication between shippers and carriers, would not necessarily be operative, and the dialogue between the covered entities that will ensure the safe food transportation requirements are understood and entities play their respective roles will not necessarily happen. This situation will disadvantage the entities that are covered businesses, especially if the shipper is not a covered entity. In situations where the shipper is not covered, we believe that the relevant information to ensure safe transport of food will be available in some form to the entities that are covered, though they may not be provided in written records, which would be ideal. Even if certain entities are not covered by the rule, all parties are subject to the general food safety requirements of the FD&C Act to prevent the adulteration of food in the United States. So I think that comment and response highlights that regardless of the application of the rule, communication is key. Asking critical information about the food safety is key to this rule, and documenting that information is in your best interest. So if you have any questions on the presentation as it's defined here, please feel free to reach out to me, and I would be happy to address your concerns. Below the post for this video will be the guidance to industry for this rule, as well as a link to some general training that's provided by the FDA that I strongly recommend that all of a feed mill driver staff participate in, loaders, receivers as well. Anybody that plays a role in your company in terms of transportation should take that training. It only takes about 20 minutes. It is general in nature. It applies to both human and animal food, but again, it's valuable information. And then, of course, training your qualified individuals on their particular roles and the food that you transport is critical in your training processes. Thank you and have a great day.